She was standing in the mud when the woman grabbed her arm. Not gently, not with concern. Margaret Hale's fingers dug into Vivian Mercer's forearm like she intended to leave marks, yanking her sideways in front of the entire population of Blackstone Ridge, 30, maybe 40 people, who had nothing better to do on a Thursday morning than watch a stranger get humiliated in the middle of Main Street. "There is no letter," Margaret announced, loud enough that even the horses heard it. "There is no arrangement, and there is certainly no place for you here." Vivian didn't pull away. She was too tired. 3 weeks on frozen roads will do that to a person. But she looked at the woman, really looked at her. And then she looked at the little girl standing at the edge of the crowd, white-faced and shaking, who had clearly just made the worst and most desperate decision of her short life. If you've ever been in a room full of people who wanted you to disappear, you know exactly how Vivian felt in that moment. If that story moves something in you, stay. Because what happens next will shake you to your core. Subscribe to our channel and follow Vivian's story all the way to the end, so you don't miss a single moment of what's coming. And if this story is already pulling at something in your chest, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. The train had not been warm. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand about Vivian Mercer's state of mind when she stepped off the platform at Blackstone Ridge. She had not slept properly in 11 days. She had eaten half a tin of crackers somewhere in Wyoming, and the last letter she'd received before boarding had been from her landlord in Cincinnati, informing her that her room had been relet to a school teacher named Dolores. She had nothing to go back to. That was the honest truth of it. That was the part she hadn't written in her reply to Gideon Hale's letter, because you didn't lead with desperation when a man was considering marrying you. You led with your qualities, your steadiness, your ability to cook, to keep accounts, to manage a household without falling apart every time something went sideways. She had qualities. She was certain of that. She was considerably less certain, standing on that platform with her single trunk and the wind coming off the ridge like something personal, that those qualities were going to matter one bit. The station master, a thin man named Pell, who had the look of someone permanently startled by his own existence, had taken one glance at her arrival paperwork and then looked up with something she could only describe as pity, preemptive pity, the kind you offer someone before they've quite understood what's about to happen to them. "You'd be the woman from Cincinnati?" he'd said. "Vivian Mercer," she confirmed. He'd nodded slowly. The way men nod when they're trying to figure out how much to tell you. She'd found out the rest on her own, about 40 feet down the main street, when she walked into a crowd that had clearly been assembled for reasons she didn't yet understand. Gideon Hale was not a difficult man to identify. He was the largest person in Blackstone Ridge, which she would later learn was saying something, because the town did not lack for large men. He stood at the edge of the group with his hat pushed back and his arms crossed and an expression on his face that she couldn't quite read. Not angry, exactly. More like a man who had been handed a problem he hadn't asked for and was working out, in real time, how irritated he was allowed to be about it. He was also, she noticed, standing next to a woman who had positioned herself close enough to his elbow to make a statement without technically making one. That woman was Margaret Hale, his late wife's sister, his nearest neighbor, and as Vivian would discover in the following minutes, the most efficient dismantler of other people's plans she had ever encountered in her 31 years of living. Vivian hadn't even made it to a proper introduction before Margaret had crossed the space between them like she'd been waiting for the chance. "Miss Mercer." Not a question, not a greeting, a classification. "Yes," Vivian said, because what else was there to say? "I don't know what you were told," Margaret said, "or what you believed you were coming here for. But I think it's only fair to inform you before this goes any further." And here she'd turned slightly, as if to include the assembled population of the street in her fairness, that Gideon Hale did not write to you. He did not arrange anything. And he certainly did not invite a stranger to come to this town and impose herself on his household. The words landed in the cold air with terrible clarity. Vivian looked past Margaret to Gideon. He didn't contradict her. He looked uncomfortable, genuinely, visibly uncomfortable. But he didn't say, "No, that's wrong. Please ignore my sister-in-law." He looked at the ground. And then he looked at Vivian, and what she saw in his face was something she hadn't expected at all. It was not cruelty. It was not dismissal. It was something closer to confusion, edged with a shame he didn't know what to do with. I did receive a letter, she said, carefully. She was not going to let her voice shake. She had decided that somewhere around the Nebraska border, and she was holding to it. Addressed from this settlement, signed with your name. I never wrote it, Gideon said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Rougher. Like a man who didn't use it much. Then someone did, Vivian said. Well, the silence that followed was the particular kind that happens in small places when everyone present knows something that one person doesn't. She could feel it, the slight shifting, the exchanged looks, the way two women near the general store turned toward each other with an expression that wasn't quite surprise. They knew, or suspected. She was working out what that meant when the crowd parted, slightly, at the far left edge. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in stories, just an opening appeared, the way openings do when something small is trying to get through. The girl was 10 years old. Maybe. She was thin in the way that meant she'd been growing faster than the food supply could keep up with. And her hair was in a braid that had been neat approximately 6 hours ago and was now mostly an intention. She was wearing a coat that was too big for her, which probably meant it had been someone else's. She stopped at the edge of the cleared space and looked at Vivian with an expression that was, Vivian would think about later, the bravest thing she'd ever seen on a child's face. Because it wasn't fearlessness, it was terror, pure, clear terror. And she stepped forward anyway. It was me, the girl said. The crowd went very quiet. I wrote the letter. Her voice was steady in the way voices get when someone has decided that falling apart is a luxury they can't afford. I found paper in Pa's desk, and I practiced his handwriting until I got it right, and I sent it. A pause. I'm sorry I made it seem like he wrote it, but I'm not sorry I sent it. Gideon turned to look at his daughter the way a man turns when the floor has just disappeared beneath him. Cora, he said. Just that. Just her name. We need someone, Cora said, and her voice cracked on the last word just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and kept going. Eli can't keep going to sleep every night asking for Mama, and you can't keep working yourself to... You can't keep working the way you're working, Pa, and I can't... She stopped. I can't do everything by myself anymore. The silence was different now, the kind that has weight. Margaret recovered first. She always recovered first, Vivian would learn. It was her particular talent. This is absurd, she said, and her voice was precisely calibrated to make the word land like a period at the end of a sentence everyone had already finished. The child is 10 years old. What she's done is, it's fraud, it's manipulation, and this woman, she turned back to Vivian, needs to understand that there is nothing for her here and arrange to be on the next train back to wherever she came from. Several people nodded. Vivian saw it. She was watching very carefully. She was also watching Cora, who had not looked away from her since the moment she'd stepped forward. The girl was waiting for something. Vivian didn't know yet what it was. I'd like to speak to Mr. Hale, Vivian said. Margaret blinked. That was something, at least. I beg your pardon? Privately, Vivian added, if he's willing. She looked at Gideon when she said it, not at Margaret, because Margaret was not the one she was asking. Gideon looked back at her for a long moment. He had gray eyes, she noticed. The kind that weren't warm exactly, but weren't cold either. Just careful, like a man who had learned to look before he stepped. All right, he said. Margaret opened her mouth. Margaret, Gideon said, and he didn't raise his voice, didn't change his tone, but something in the way he said it closed the conversation, and she pressed her lips together and stepped back. They stood at the edge of the livery because it was the nearest building that offered any privacy, which was not very much. Blackstone Ridge was the sort of town where sound traveled and people permitted it to. But it was enough. I'm not going to pretend this isn't a strange situation, Vivian said. That would be difficult, Gideon agreed. I sold my furniture, she said. I gave up my room. I have enough money left for 2 nights at a lodging house, and I don't know if this town has one. It has half of one, Gideon said. Pell rents rooms above the station. All right. She filed that away. I'm not telling you any of that to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you so that you understand I'm not standing in front of you out of romantic expectation or delusion. I came here because I needed a situation and your daughter. Your daughter wrote a very convincing letter. I didn't know it wasn't from you. And now I know. and I'm trying to figure out what to do next." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, she realized. He'd taken it off at some point without her noticing, and he was turning the brim through his fingers in a slow circle. Not nervously, more like it was something to do while he thought. "The letter," he said. "What did it say exactly?" "That you were a widower with 2 children and you needed someone who could manage a household. That you weren't looking for romance, just competence. That you could offer a home, fair treatment, and enough to live on." She paused. "Your daughter wrote it well. She knew what to say." Something moved across Gideon's face at that. Not quite grief and not quite pride. "She's been managing the household herself," he said, "since her mother died, 14 months. "I know," Vivian said. "I could see it when she stepped forward. She's 10 years old." "Yes." He put his hat back on, pushed it down with one deliberate motion. "What are you asking me for, Miss Mercer?" Vivian had asked herself that question somewhere between Missouri and Kansas, and she had a reasonably clear answer by now. "A trial," she said. 3 weeks. I'll work. I won't make demands. If at the end of 3 weeks you want me gone, I'll go without argument. And if I say no right now, then I'll find out if Pell has a room and I'll figure out something else." She said it plainly, because it was plain. "I'm not going to beg and I'm not going to cause a scene, but I thought it was worth asking." Gideon Hale did not say yes. That was the first thing. He said, "Let me think on it," which was not a yes, but was not the no she had halfway expected, and he said it quietly enough that she almost missed it under the noise of the wind. And then he walked back toward the main street, and she stood at the edge of the livery for a moment alone and let herself breathe. She was afraid. There was no use pretending otherwise. She was afraid and tired, and the back of her left knee had been aching since Nebraska from the cold, and the town of Blackstone Ridge smelled like pine smoke and horse, and something mineral and sharp that she couldn't identify. And she had approximately $43 to her name. She had been in worse situations. She told herself that. She wasn't sure she believed it, but she told herself. Margaret found her within the hour. Not approached. Found. As if she'd been tracking the location and waited for the appropriate moment. "I want to be clear with you," Margaret said, without preamble, which Vivian was beginning to understand was her only register. "What that child did is not charming. It's not precocious, or whatever word you might be reaching for. She is a troubled little girl who has had too much responsibility and not enough guidance. And what she needs is structure, not some stranger arriving from Cincinnati to validate her manipulations." "I don't think that's what I would be doing," Vivian said. "I think you're not in any position to know what you'd be doing," Margaret said, and her voice was pleasant about it, which was the unnerving part. "You've been here 4 hours. You don't know this family, you don't know this town, and you certainly don't know what Gideon needs." "But you do." A pause. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, just slightly, just for a second. "I've known him for 17 years. I was his wife's sister. I have been looking after this family since Eleanor died, and I will continue to do so." "I'm sure you will," Vivian said. It was not the response Margaret had expected. Vivian could see that. She'd expected argument or deflection or the kind of nervous apology that people offered when they were trying to take up less space. "You should leave," Margaret said. The pleasantness was gone now. "I'm telling you plainly. Whatever you think might happen here, it won't. Gideon will do the reasonable thing, and you will go home." "I don't have a home to go to," Vivian said. She said it without self-pity, just as information, because it was true, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "That," she said, "is not Gideon Hale's problem." She walked away. Cora found her as the afternoon light started to thin. The girl came around the side of the station like she'd been waiting at a distance, watching for a safe moment. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Vivian said. Cora considered this. She had Eleanor Hale's cheekbones. Vivian would eventually learn. That same precise angle that photographs well and reads as determination in person. Right now it just read as worry. "I didn't think about what would happen," Cora said. "I mean, I thought about you coming. I thought about what it would be like. I didn't think about what it would look like in front of everyone." "No," Vivian said. "I don't suppose you did." I wasn't trying to be cruel to you," Cora said. "I want you to know that. I read every mail-order marriage advertisement I could find, and yours was the only one that said you'd managed a bakery and kept accounts. The others were all, they were looking for something different. What were they looking for? Romance, Cora said, with a 10-year-old's absolute certainty that this was the wrong priority. We don't need romance. We need someone who knows how to do things. Vivian looked at her for a moment. You're very practical, she said. Somebody has to be, Cora said, and then quieter. Eli cried for her every night for 4 months. He's 6. He doesn't really remember her face anymore, but he still cries. And Pa... She stopped. Pa isn't... He works. That's what he does. He works from before sunrise, and he doesn't stop until he can't stand up anymore, and I think he does it so he doesn't have to think. But that's not living. That's just waiting. Vivian looked at the girl for a long time. What's your brother like? She asked. Something in Cora's face shifted. Loud, she said. He talks constantly. He's convinced there's a fox living under the porch, and he names everything, every horse, every chicken. He named the broken fence post Gerald. She paused. He's a lot. He sounds like it, Vivian said. He's also... Cora stopped again, pressed her lips together the same way she had in the street. He's the best thing about our family right now. He still thinks everything's going to be okay. I don't want him to stop thinking that. The wind came in off the ridge again, cold and clean and absolute. I'll wait, Vivian said, to see what your father says. Cora nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. The letter said you were 31, she said. It also said you weren't afraid of hard work or difficult men. Was that true? Vivian thought about that honestly. The age is accurate, she said. Cora almost smiled. It was the barest beginning of one. Good enough, she said, and she went back toward the direction of the ranch. Gideon came to her at the station as the sun dropped behind the ridge. She was sitting on her trunk outside because Pell had needed the waiting room for a delivery, and she was beginning to lose feeling in her feet, and she had been thinking, very carefully, about what she would do if the answer was no. She hadn't arrived at anything satisfying. He stood in front of her and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her. The way he looked, she was beginning to understand, was not rudeness. It was just how he processed things. He needed to see them clearly before he spoke. 3 weeks, he said finally. Yes. You cook? Yes. Keep accounts? I was doing the books for a bakery when I left. 3 years. The work is hard, he said. The ranch it's not comfortable. We don't have much. I'm not looking for much, Vivian said. He was quiet again, and then, You're not afraid of Cora? The question surprised her. Why would I be afraid of Cora? She runs things, he said, and there was something complicated in his voice when he said it. Pride and guilt and grief all folded into each other. She's been running things, and I've let her. That's the honest truth of it. I let a 10-year-old run my household because I couldn't... He stopped. She might be difficult. She's decided things should go certain ways, and she holds to it. She seems very clear about what she wants, Vivian said. She is. He paused. She wanted you, specifically you. She's been reading advertisements for 8 months. Vivian felt something in her chest that she couldn't quite name. I know, she said. She told me. He nodded slowly, turned his hat through his hands again, put it back on. 3 weeks, he said again. After that, we'll see. He walked away without waiting for her answer, which she supposed was answer enough. She sat on her trunk for another few minutes in the cold. Her feet were completely numb now. She was hungry and tired, and the ridge above the town was turning the color of iron in the last light. And somewhere down the main street she could hear Margaret Hale's voice, distinct and carrying, in conversation with someone she couldn't see. She picked up her trunk. She had 3 weeks. She intended to make them count. The ranch was worse than she'd expected. Not the land itself. The land was something else entirely. All that open space pressing out against the ridge like it had been there long before anything human and would be there long after. But the house. The house had the look of a place that had been holding its breath for over a year and hadn't quite figured out how to start breathing again. The porch boards were warped from 2 winters without proper sealing. The kitchen window had a crack running diagonal across the lower pane, stuffed with a rag that had been there long enough to turn gray. The woodpile was adequate. Gideon had at least kept up with that. But the stack of mending on the chair by the fireplace was tall enough that it had started leaning, and whoever had last swept the main room had swept it toward the corner and left it there. Vivian stood in the doorway of the kitchen on her first morning and took stock. She did not say anything. She had learned early in life that commenting on the state of things people were already ashamed of was the fastest way to make them defensive, and a defensive man was a man who would find reasons to send you away. She made coffee. That was the first thing. She found the beans in a tin above the stove and the grinder on a shelf, and she made enough coffee for 3 adults and set it on the table without announcement. Gideon came in from the barn at first light smelling of horses and cold air and stopped short when he saw the pot. "I didn't ask you to." "I know," Vivian said. "I made it anyway." He looked at her for a moment with that same careful expression she was beginning to map, the one where he was measuring something she couldn't quite see. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down and poured himself a cup without another word. That was their first morning. Cora came in 20 minutes later with Eli attached to her arm like a barnacle, the boy still in his nightshirt, hair pointing in 4 directions, clutching a wooden horse with the kind of grip that suggested it went everywhere with him. He was 6 and compact and had Eleanor's dark hair and Gideon's gray eyes and absolutely no capacity for silence. "You're the lady from the letter," he announced. "I am," Vivian said. "Cora said you came on a train." 3 trains, actually." Eli considered this with great seriousness. "I've never been on a train. Cora says they're loud." "They are," Vivian agreed. "Very loud. And they smell like burning coal and other people's food." Eli seemed to find this deeply satisfying information. He climbed into a chair, still holding the wooden horse, and looked at the coffee pot with the focused attention of someone who had been told he couldn't have something and was working out the exact edges of that prohibition. "That's for grown people," Cora said, without looking up from the bread she was already slicing. She moved around the kitchen with an efficiency that was painful to watch, not because it was wrong, but because it was too right, too practiced. The movements of someone who had learned the space out of necessity, not comfort. Vivian watched her for a moment and then said carefully, "Cora, why don't you sit down? I'll get the bread." Cora's hand stopped. "I always do the bread." "I know, but you don't have to today." The girl turned and looked at her. Not suspicious exactly. More like someone who had been offered something unfamiliar and wasn't sure yet if it was safe to take. "I know where everything is," Cora said. "Then you can tell me where things are and I'll find them," Vivian said. "Sit down, drink something." It took another moment. Then Cora pulled out a chair and sat, and she did it the way Vivian had learned to recognize in people who had been running on fumes, like the chair was catching her rather than the other way around. Eli immediately leaned over and put his wooden horse on the table in front of her, a peace offering, or possibly just a demonstration. "That's Gerald," he told Vivian. "Hello, Gerald," Vivian said. Eli beamed. Gideon said nothing, but she felt him watching her from across the table, and she kept her eyes on what she was doing and didn't make anything of it. That was the first morning. The first week was something else. She did not try to change everything at once. That was a mistake people made. Coming into someone else's home and immediately rearranging it according to their own logic. She watched instead. She watched how things ran, where the gaps were, what Cora had been doing that she'd had no business doing at 10 years old. The accounts, for one. The girl had been keeping a ledger, rough but accurate, tracking the household expenses against the income from the cattle sales. Vivian found it tucked under the kitchen shelf and opened it and stood there for a long moment, looking at the careful handwriting. The columns that didn't quite line up because whoever had taught Cora to keep a ledger had given her the concept without the proper format. She had been doing this for 8 months, since shortly after her mother died. Vivian put the ledger back where she found it and didn't say anything about it until 2 days later, when she sat down next to Cora in the evening and said, "Would you show me what you've been tracking?" Cora looked at her with that measuring expression she'd inherited from her father. "How did you know about that?" "I was looking for a pan and found it by accident," Vivian said honestly. "I wasn't snooping." A pause. Then Cora got up and retrieved the ledger and set it on the table between them with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to trust something they weren't entirely sure about. They went through it together. Vivian showed her the proper column structure, showed her how to carry totals forward, showed her the difference between tracking expenses and projecting them. Cora absorbed it with an intensity that was slightly unnerving. She asked 3 questions during the whole conversation, and every one of them was exactly the right question. "You learned accounts at a bakery?" she asked. 3 years, Vivian said. "Before that, I kept books for a dry goods store. Before that, I was a telegraph operator." Cora looked up from the ledger. "A telegraph operator?" "For 2 years. I was fast." "How fast?" "Faster than the men, which is why they let me go when the railroad came through and brought their own operators." Cora absorbed this. "That wasn't fair." "No," Vivian agreed. "It wasn't." "What did you do?" "Found the bakery job," Vivian said. "And then the bakery owner died and his son decided he didn't need someone keeping the accounts because he was going to do it himself." She paused. "He was not good at it. The bakery closed 6 months later." "And then you saw the advertisement," Cora said. "And then I saw the advertisement," Vivian confirmed. Cora looked back down at the ledger. Her finger traced one of the columns. "I'm sorry it was my letter and not a real one," she said. "That was wrong of me, I know that." "It was," Vivian said. "But you were trying to solve a problem." "I should have asked Pa." "What would he have said?" Cora was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "He would have said no. He would have said we were managing fine." Her voice was completely flat when she said it. Not bitter, just factual in the way that facts are when you've looked at them long enough that they stop hurting. "Are you managing fine?" Vivian asked. Cora looked up. And for just a second, underneath all that careful competence, Vivian saw exactly what was there. A 10-year-old girl who was exhausted and scared and had been holding something heavy for so long she'd forgotten what her arms felt like without it. "No," Cora said. "All right," Vivian said. "Then we'll fix that." She didn't make it a promise. She had learned not to make promises she couldn't guarantee, but she said it with enough steadiness that Cora looked at her for another moment, and then nodded, once, and they went back to the ledger. Gideon heard part of that conversation. She wasn't sure how much. She heard him stop on the other side of the door and then keep moving. But something shifted in him after that, small, almost invisible. But she was paying attention, and she saw it. He started coming in for dinner instead of eating whatever she left out for him. That was how small it was. That was how significant. The second week brought its own complications. Margaret came to the ranch on a Wednesday. She didn't knock. She came around to the kitchen door with a covered dish and the expression of someone performing charity in a place that had not asked for it. "I brought a roast," she said, when Vivian opened the door. "That's kind of you," Vivian said. "Gideon's in the south pasture. Cora and Eli are in the barn." "I know where they are," Margaret said. Which was true. She probably did. She'd been coming to this house for 17 years. She knew its rhythms better than Vivian ever would, and they both knew it. She came in. There was no graceful way to stop her without being openly rude, and Vivian had made a decision early that she wasn't going to be openly rude to Margaret Hale. Not because she liked her, but because open warfare with the most well-connected woman in Blackstone Ridge would cost her more than she could spend. Margaret set the dish on the counter and looked at the kitchen. It had been 2 weeks since Vivian's arrival, and the kitchen looked different. Not dramatically, but in the ways that mattered. The cracked window rag had been replaced with properly fitted oilcloth. The mending pile was gone. There was bread cooling on the rack and a pot of soup on the stove, and the ledger was open on the side table, neatly organized. Margaret took all of this in. "You've been busy," she said. "There was a fair amount to do," Vivian said, without inflection. Margaret moved towards the table and pulled out a chair and sat, which she had clearly done 1,000 times. And it was such an easy ownership of the space that Vivian had to actively decide not to let it bother her. "How is Gideon?" "Better than when I arrived, I think. He's sleeping more." "He works himself half to death," Margaret said. "He always has. Eleanor used to get after him for it." She said the name carefully, testing something. "I know," Vivian said. "Cora told me." Margaret looked at her sharply. "Cora told you about Eleanor?" "Some. That she was funny and that she couldn't abide a messy kitchen and that she used to sing while she worked even when she was off-key." Vivian paused. "Eli told me the last part. Apparently it was a memorable characteristic." Something crossed Margaret's face that was not quite what she'd intended to show. It was grief, actually. Real, uncalculated grief. The kind that doesn't care who's watching. It was gone in a second, but it had been there, and Vivian noted it and filed it away. Margaret had loved Eleanor too. Of course she had. The situation was more complicated than it had looked from the outside. She loved this family, Margaret said, after a moment. I believe that, Vivian said. She meant it. I have been looking after them. I know you have, Vivian said. Cora told me that too. She said you brought food every week and helped with the washing when things got very bad. She looked at Margaret directly. I'm not trying to replace what you've done, Mrs. Hale. I'm trying to help with what's left to do. Margaret studied her. It was a different kind of study than before. Not the dismissal she'd offered at the station, but something more careful. What exactly do you want from this arrangement? She said finally. A home, Vivian said. Work. Somewhere to be useful. That's all? That's what I came for. She paused. Whatever else happens, that's not something I'm calculating on. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, and she straightened her jacket with 2 precise tugs, and she looked at the room one more time, all the small changes, the bread, the fixed window, the open ledger, and Vivian thought she saw something in her expression that she hadn't expected. It might have been, very faintly, respect, or the beginning of it. I'll see myself out, Margaret said. And she did. But she left the roast. Vivian stood in the kitchen after she was gone and breathed for a minute. Then she went back to the soup. That was the second week. Eli was the one who caught her off guard. She had expected the boy to be easy. He was open and loud and had none of his sister's wariness, but she hadn't expected him to trust her so completely so fast. It was almost frightening, actually, how quickly he decided she was safe. By the 5th day, he was following her around the kitchen narrating things. Not asking, narrating, as if she were an audience for the ongoing production of his observations. The fox under the porch. A strange rock he'd found in the creek. The relative merits of every horse in the barn, ranked by how much they seemed to like him personally. Thistle likes me best, he told her, while she was kneading bread. She always comes to the fence when she sees me. That's because you bring her apples, Cora said, from across the room. She'd come even without the apples, Eli said, with absolute certainty. She really wouldn't, Cora said. You don't know that. Eli, she's a horse. Eli looked at Vivian. Thistle likes me, he said, in the tone of someone reporting an established fact. I'm sure she does, Vivian said. Cora made a small sound of exasperation that was, Vivian noticed, almost exactly the sound a mother would make. Not intentionally, just by accident of repetition, because Cora had been doing this so long it had shaped her. That night, after the children were in bed, Vivian was at the table going through the accounts when Gideon came in and poured himself water from the pitcher and stood at the kitchen counter and didn't leave. She had learned that this was how it worked with him. He didn't announce himself, didn't say, "Can I talk to you?" Just occupied the same space and waited to see if something would happen. She kept working, let him get there on his own schedule. Eli hasn't been sleeping well, he said eventually. Since Eleanor. He wakes up and he doesn't always know where he is. A pause. Last night he came out and found you at the table and went back to bed. She hadn't known he'd seen that. He woke up around 2, she said. He didn't seem scared, just disoriented. I told him where he was and he went back. He didn't wake Cora? No. Gideon was quiet. Cora's the one he usually wakes, he said. She's been sleeping with one ear open for months. I know, Vivian said. I could tell. The lamp between them put a long shadow on the wall. Outside, the ridge was dark and the wind had come up again, that same cold particular wind that seemed to live specifically in this valley. She shouldn't be doing all of that, Gideon said. He said it like he was confessing something, like the sentence had been sitting behind his teeth for a while and had finally found its way out. I know she shouldn't. I knew it before you got here, and I didn't. He stopped. I don't have a good explanation for that. You were grieving, Vivian said. I'm still grieving. I know. She looked up from the ledger. That's not an accusation, Mr. Hale. I'm not saying it like it's your fault that you were. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was older than it was in daylight. Not in a bad way, just more visible. More honest about what it had been through. You can call me Gideon, he said. You've been here 2 weeks and you know what I owe on the east pasture. First names seem reasonable. All right, Vivian said. He nodded once, pushed off the counter, started toward the hall, and then stopped. The bread this morning was good, he said, without turning around. Eli ate half a loaf before Cora caught him. I noticed the loaf was suspiciously reduced, Vivian said. And then something happened that she hadn't seen yet. Gideon Hale smiled. Not broadly. Not the open smile his son had or the careful, cautious one his daughter was beginning to offer. Just a small tightening at the corner of his mouth, there and gone. But it had been there. He went to bed. She went back to the accounts. Things were not fixed. She had no illusions about that. The ranch was still behind on 2 payments, and the east fence needed rebuilding, and Cora still woke up before the sun every morning because her body had forgotten how to do otherwise, and Gideon still worked until he couldn't stand as often as not. There was a long way to go. But the bread had been good, and the boy was sleeping, and that was something. She was on her way back from the Dunnett farm on a Friday afternoon at the end of the second week. She'd been trading bread for eggs, which had been Cora's arrangement, and she'd kept it going, when she heard the conversation coming from inside the general store before she reached the door. She recognized the voice immediately. Margaret's. And another woman's, sharp, certain, the kind of voice that speaks at a volume calibrated for an audience. Can't imagine what she's thinking, staying on. The whole town saw what happened. She's got nowhere else to go, is what I heard, the second voice said. That's why she won't leave. She latched on, and she intends to stay latched. She's been whispering in that child's ear, Margaret said, and her voice was careful, not the pragmatic, almost honest Margaret that Vivian had spoken to in the kitchen, but a different one, the public version. The girl was impressionable to begin with. Now she's got some stranger telling her. I don't know what she's telling her. What does Gideon say? He doesn't say anything, Margaret said. That's the problem. He's too tired and He's not himself. He hasn't been himself. And she's taking advantage of that. Vivian stood outside the door for a moment. She thought about going in, saying something, making it known she'd heard every word. She didn't. She turned around, walked back to the ranch, and set the eggs down on the kitchen table and stood at the window for a while looking at the ridge and deciding, very deliberately, what kind of person she was going to be about this. Cora came in from the barn. You're back, she said. How were the Dunnett eggs? Fine, Vivian said. Good. Cora looked at her for a moment with those clear, slightly too old eyes. What happened? Nothing, Vivian said. Nothing I didn't expect. Cora was quiet. Then, carefully. Was it Aunt Margaret? Vivian looked at her. What makes you ask that? She came here twice this week, Cora said. She doesn't usually come twice, and she keeps asking me what you talk about. The girl's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. She asked me last Sunday whether you'd said anything about my father, whether you'd said anything about marrying him. What did you tell her? I told her no, Cora said. Because you haven't. You haven't talked about that with me at all. Vivian looked at her daughter, at this girl who was not her daughter, who she had known for 2 weeks, who had forged a letter and sent it across 3 states because she was 10 years old and scared and trying to save something. I'm not here to take anything from your aunt, Vivian said. I'm not here to replace your mother. I'm here because you wrote me a letter and I answered it, and I think this is somewhere I can be useful. She paused. That's still true. Cora looked at her for a long moment. She's going to keep trying to make you leave, she said. It wasn't a question. Probably, Vivian said. Are you going to? Vivian thought about the accounts on the table and the bread and Eli's wooden horse and the small tightening at the corner of Gideon Hale's mouth in the lamplight. No, she said. Cora nodded, and then she did something she hadn't done before. She sat down at the table next to Vivian, not across from her, not at a careful distance, but next to her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Okay, she said. Then I'll help. The 3 weeks ended on a Sunday. Gideon found her in the kitchen in the morning, which was where he'd taken to finding her, and he poured his coffee and stood at the counter for longer than usual. She could tell something was coming. She'd learned to read the particular texture of his silences. 3 weeks, he said. Yes, Vivian said. I said we'd see, at the end. You did. He was quiet. Outside, Eli's voice carried from the barn. He was telling Thistle something urgent, the words not quite distinguishable, but the tone very much that of a small boy with important news. I need to tell you something, Gideon said. She waited. When Eleanor died, I told myself I was managing, he said. I told myself the kids were fine. I told myself I had it handled. He looked at his coffee cup. I didn't have it handled. I was barely present. I was here, but I wasn't. And my daughter was running the house and keeping the books and waking up every time her brother had a nightmare. And I let that happen. I let it happen because it was easier than being awake. The weight of it sat between them. I know, Vivian said. What you've done here, he said, and he stopped and started again. It's not just the house being cleaner or the accounts being straight. It's... Cora laughed this week. On Tuesday, she laughed at something Eli said, and I stopped outside because I couldn't remember the last time I heard that. He set his cup down. That was you. That was because you're here. Vivian looked at him steadily. It was you too, she said. You started coming to dinner. You stopped sending them to bed before you came in. You're more present than you were 2 weeks ago. Because you make it easier to be, he said, and it came out like something he hadn't planned to say. They were both quiet. I'm not going to pretend this is a normal situation, Gideon said finally. It's not. My daughter forged a letter and you came here on the strength of it, and none of that is how things should happen. No, Vivian agreed. It's not. But you're here, he said, and the house is... He looked around the kitchen. The house feels like itself again. I didn't know how much I missed that until it started coming back. He looked at her then, full on, the way he didn't often. I'm asking you to stay, he said. Not as a transaction, not because it's practical, though it is. Because I think you belong here, and because Cora chose you, and because Eli named the horse she likes for her benefit, so she'd have a reason to come to the barn, and I think that child would be bereft if you left. Vivian's throat did something she didn't intend. He named Gerald after me, she said. Gerald is the fence post, Gideon said. Thistle is the horse. He renamed her Vivian last Thursday, and then panicked and told Cora it was a coincidence. She laughed. She hadn't laughed in she didn't know how long. It came out of her unexpectedly, genuine and a little rough at the edges. And Gideon looked at her with that almost smile again, more present this time. Stay, he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a proposal with any of the formality that word implied. It was just a man who had been alone in the wrong way for too long asking someone to stop being a guest. All right, Vivian said. And that was how it was settled. Margaret heard about it by Monday afternoon. Vivian didn't know exactly how. Blackstone Ridge was a small town, and small towns had their own news network that operated on a speed and accuracy that no telegraph could match. But by the time she went to the store for flour, the woman behind the counter was looking at her with a certain quality of interest that told her the information had moved. And then, coming out, she walked directly into Clara Norris. Clara Norris was 50-something and owned the largest house on the north side of town and had been widowed 3 years ago in a way that had left her very well positioned and very aware of it, and she was standing on the store steps with Margaret Hale and a woman Vivian didn't know, and all three of them were watching her approach with the particular expression of people who have been discussing you and have not yet decided whether to pretend otherwise. Miss Mercer, Clara said. Mrs. Norris, Vivian said. She nodded at Margaret. Mrs. Hale. I heard you're staying on, Clara said. It was said pleasantly. Everything Clara Norris said was said pleasantly. How wonderful for everyone. I hope so, Vivian said. You must tell me. Clara tilted her head slightly. How does one build a life in a place where one wasn't wanted? I've always found that so fascinating, the persistence of it. Vivian looked at her. She could feel Margaret watching, waiting, maybe, to see what she would do. I think, Vivian said quietly and clearly, that being wanted is something you earn, not something you arrive with. Clara blinked. Vivian picked up her flour and walked home. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the ranch. She set the flour down and stood at the kitchen counter and breathed. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like the particular trembling that happens when you've held something together under pressure and the pressure is briefly gone. Cora came in from the other room and looked at her hands. Aunt Margaret? She said. Clara Norris, Vivian said. Cora made a sound that was unmistakably a very small growl. It was so completely unexpected and so completely appropriate that Vivian almost laughed again. She's worse than Aunt Margaret, Cora said. At least Aunt Margaret means it for the right reasons, even when she's wrong. Clara Norris just likes watching people trip. That's a very perceptive thing to say, Vivian said. I've been watching this town my whole life, Cora said. I know who's who. She said it the way you say something when you're 10 and a half and have had to be older than that for over a year, and Vivian looked at her, this sharp, careful, terrifyingly capable girl who had started all of this with forged handwriting and 8 months of reading newspaper advertisements, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Thank you, Vivian said. Cora looked at her. For what? For writing the letter, Vivian said. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully, she reached out and took the flour from Vivian's hands. I'll start the bread, she said. You sit down for a minute. Vivian sat down. Outside, Eli was telling Thistle, Vivian, about the fox under the porch. The wind was coming off the ridge, cold and clear and constant. In the barn, she could hear Gideon moving, the low, deliberate sounds of a man who was starting, slowly, to be present in his own life again. Nothing was fixed. She knew that. But she was staying, and that for now was enough to build on. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was how Vivian would always remember it. Not by the date, not by the weather, but by the fact that she had just finished fixing the east kitchen shelf that had been leaning since before she arrived, and she'd felt for the first time in weeks like something in the house was genuinely level. Then Gideon came in with the envelope and set it on the table without a word, and she looked at his face, and the feeling of levelness went away. The letter was from the Harlan County Land Registry Office. It was 3 paragraphs long and written in the dry, impersonal language of official documents that have been designed to say something devastating without sounding like they care. The summary of it was this. The Hale Ranch had been identified as carrying unpaid property tax dating back 22 months, and unless the full balance, $460, was settled within 60 days, the property would be subject to seizure and public auction. Gideon set the letter on the table and stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and said nothing for a long time. Vivian picked it up and read it twice. You've been paying the taxes, she said. It was not a question. She had seen the ledger entries, Cora's careful columns, tracking every payment. Every quarter, he said, same as always. Then where did 22 months come from? That's what I'd like to know. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man who had been hit hard enough that the anger hadn't arrived yet, just the dull, flat shock of it, and underneath that something older and more worn. The look of someone who has been weathering things for so long that a new storm barely registers as different from the last one. Vivian looked at the letter again. The registry office stamp. The signature at the bottom, a clerk's name she didn't recognize, neat and impersonal. And a secondary notation in the lower right corner, small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking, referred by Harlan Valley Railroad Development Syndicate, per regional tax audit request. She set the letter down. Gideon, she said, look at this. He looked. She watched him read the notation, watched something shift in his expression, the shock receding, something sharper moving in behind it. The railroad, he said. Who are they? She asked, because she'd heard the word since arriving in Blackstone Ridge, but hadn't yet understood the shape of it. Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down like a man who needed to be closer to the ground. The Harlan Valley Railroad Development Syndicate, he said, has been buying land in this valley for 2 years, ranches mostly. They come with offers, not bad ones on the surface, and most people are tired enough or scared enough that they take them. He looked at the letter. The ones who don't take the offers start having problems. What kind of problems? Tax problems, he said. Water rights problems. Fence disputes. Hal Briggs over on the North Ridge had his grazing permits pulled last spring. He held out 6 months and then sold. He paused. They need a clear line through this valley for the rail extension. Our land sits directly in the middle of it. Vivian thought about the notation. Her regional tax audit request. Not a standard review. A request. Someone had asked for this specific ranch to be audited. Have they approached you? She asked. 3 months before Eleanor died, he said. A man named Aldous Webb came out here with a briefcase and a smile and an offer of $2,000. He said the number with a particular kind of flatness. I told him the ranch wasn't for sale. And he went away. He smiled and shook my hand and went away, Gideon said. And then Eleanor got sick, and then... He stopped. I haven't heard from them directly since. I thought maybe they'd moved on. They didn't move on, Vivian said. No, he said. They didn't. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, Eli's voice carried from the yard. He was telling someone, possibly the fox, possibly Gerald the fence post, about a dream he'd had about a river. The ordinary afternoon sounds of the ranch, completely unaware of the letter on the kitchen table. 60 days, Vivian said. I don't have $460, Gideon said. Not liquid, not without selling cattle, and selling at this time of year I'd get half of what they're worth. We need to see the payment records, she said. The actual receipts. Every tax payment you've made in the last 2 years. He looked at her. You think they forged the delinquency? I think someone requested an audit on a ranch that's been paying its taxes for years and somehow found 22 months of delinquency. She said it carefully. I think that's worth looking at closely before we accept that the $460 is real. Gideon was quiet. He had that look again, the one where he was measuring something she couldn't see. The receipts are in the strongbox, he said. In the bedroom. Then let's start there, Vivian said. He got the strongbox. She cleared the table. They spread 2 years of receipts across the surface, and Vivian went through them the way she'd learned to go through accounts. Methodically, quietly, not looking for what she expected to find, but looking at what was actually there. The payments were all recorded. Quarterly, consistent, dated. The amounts matched what she'd seen in Cora's ledger. There was no gap, no missed quarter, no period of 22 months in which Gideon Hale had failed to pay what he owed on his land. These are real, she said. I know they're real, he said. I made them. Then the registry has wrong records, she said, or the records were changed. Gideon looked at the receipts spread across the table. His hands were flat on the surface beside them, and she noticed his knuckles were white. Can records be changed? She asked. At the county level? If you know the right people, he said, or if you are the right people. He looked up. Aldous Webb didn't come out here alone 3 months before Eleanor died. He came with a man named Pruitt, Deputy Land Commissioner for Harlan County. He said the title with a very particular kind of quiet. They were very friendly with each other. The shape of it was becoming clearer. We need someone in the registry office, Vivian said. Someone who can pull the actual records and compare them to these. The registry office is in Harlan, Gideon said, 40 miles east. I know. Can we get there? We can get there, he said. Whether they'll let us see the records is a different matter. Cora appeared in the doorway. She had the look she got when she'd been within earshot long enough to have absorbed the situation. Not eavesdropping, just the natural result of living in a house where the kitchen table was the center of everything. I heard, she said. She looked at the receipts. How many other ranches? Gideon looked at her. What? You said Hal Briggs. Who else? Cora. I'm asking a real question, Pa, she said, and she said it gently but firmly in the way that she had, the way that wasn't quite a child speaking. If they did this to us, and they did this to Hal Briggs, they did it to more people. How many? Gideon and Vivian looked at each other. I don't know, he said. Then that's what we need to find out, Cora said. She came to the table and looked at the receipts, scanning them with those quick, precise eyes. We have proof for us. We need to find out who else has it too. 10 years old, running a household since she was 9. And right, completely right, about the strategy. Vivian looked at Gideon. She's right, she said. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Something in his face, not for the first time since Vivian had arrived, but more visible now, moved through something complicated and came out the other side. Yeah, he said quietly, she is. The news about the letter reached Margaret by the next day, because news in Blackstone Ridge had its own gravity, and it always found her eventually. She came to the ranch in the late afternoon, and she came alone, without a covered dish, which told Vivian something. She sat at the kitchen table across from Gideon with her hands folded and her expression doing something more difficult than usual to read. Aldous Webb is back in town, she said. Gideon went very still. Since when? He said. He came in on yesterday's stage. He's at the Norris boarding house. A pause. Clara knows him. I don't know how well. Vivian thought about Clara Norris on the store steps. That particular pleasantness, the question about building a life where you weren't wanted. She thought about the timing of it. Has he spoken to anyone yet? She asked. Margaret looked at her, not with hostility, with something more careful. He spoke to Tom Dunnett last night, she said. I heard about it this morning. Tom wouldn't tell me what was said. Tom Dunnett, whose eggs Vivian had been collecting every week. He's working the neighbors, Gideon said. That's what it looks like, Margaret said. She pressed her lips together, and then she said something that clearly cost her something to say. Gideon, what do you need? He looked at his sister-in-law. She looked back at him. They had been in this house together in various configurations for 17 years, and they had been on difficult terms for at least the last year of those. And Vivian was watching something work itself through between them that was older and more tangled than anything she was part of. I need someone to go to the Dunnetts, Gideon said, and to the Pettigrew place, and whoever else Webb's been talking to. I need to know how many families have gotten letters like ours. Margaret nodded. I can do that. Margaret, Gideon said, and his voice shifted slightly. Thank you. She stood and straightened her jacket with those two precise tugs Vivian had come to recognize. Don't thank me, she said. Eleanor loved this land. I'm not going to sit here and watch someone take it. She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked at Vivian. Something in her expression had changed. Again, not quite what Vivian expected. You were right, she said, about what you said at the store. Being wanted is something you earn. She left before Vivian could respond. Gideon looked at Vivian. What happened at the store? He said. Clara Norris said something unkind, Vivian said. I said something back. What did you say? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. That was exactly right, he said. Aldous Webb came to the ranch on a Thursday morning. Vivian saw him coming up the track from the kitchen window. A neat man, medium height, with the kind of clothes that were expensive but calibrated not to look it. The briefcase was the same one Gideon had described. He carried it like it was light, which it probably wasn't. She went to the door before he knocked. He looked at her with the pleasant, practiced surprise of a man who had been told there was a woman at the Hale Ranch and was adjusting his approach in real time. Good morning, he said. I'm looking for Gideon Hale. He's in the south pasture, Vivian said. Can I help you? Aldous Webb, he said, extending his hand. Harlan Valley Railroad Development. She shook it. His grip was measured. Not too firm, not too soft. Calibrated. Vivian Hale, she said. She had not used that name before. She said it now because it was, in all the ways that mattered, accurate, and because she wanted to see what it did to his expression. What it did was very small and very revealing, just a fractional hesitation before his smile reassembled. I wasn't aware Gideon had... Recently, she said. Is there something I can pass along to him? I'd prefer to speak with him directly, Webb said, if it's all the same. It's a fair ride out to the south pasture, Vivian said. I can let him know you came by. I'll wait, Webb said pleasantly. All right, Vivian said, equally pleasantly. The porch is there. She closed the door. Not in his face, just closed it, with exactly the right amount of finality, and went to find Cora. The man from the railroad is on the porch, she said. Cora looked up from the table where she'd been practicing her new ledger format. Webb? Yes. Cora closed the ledger. I'll get Pa. Not yet, Vivian said. I want to do something first. She sat down across from Cora. You know this valley better than I do. You know which families have land the railroad would want. Can you write them down for me? Cora had a piece of paper and a pencil in her hand before Vivian finished the sentence. Webb waited on the porch for 40 minutes before Gideon came back from the south pasture, and by then Vivian had a list of 11 family names and a reasonable map of which parcels were where and which ones would be necessary for a straight rail line through the valley. She also had, thanks to Cora's very particular memory, the name of every family who had sold in the last 2 years and the rough dates they'd done it. She handed both to Gideon before he went to the porch, and she watched through the kitchen window while he spoke to Webb, and she watched his face the whole time. Webb did most of the talking. He had the easy, flowing delivery of someone who had made this speech many times and had refined it down to the parts that worked. Gideon listened. He was good at listening. She'd known that since the first morning. He listened the way people do when they're not planning to tell you what they're actually thinking. She could see from the window the moment Webb mentioned the tax letter. Gideon's posture didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders did. Webb was using the letter. Of course he was. Not as a threat exactly. He was too careful for that, but as context. As a reminder of a problem that had, coincidentally, appeared just before he did. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Then Webb stood and shook Gideon's hand and walked back down the track, and Gideon stood on the porch for a moment watching him go. He came inside. He offered $3,500, he said. Vivian looked up. That was considerably more than the $2,000 he'd offered before Eleanor died. He's more eager than he was, she said. He's working a deadline, Gideon said. He as much as told me. They've got investors who need the rail extension committed by end of year. He set his hat on the table. He said the tax situation could be resolved if we came to an agreement. He said that directly? Not directly enough to be held to it, Gideon said, but directly enough that I understood him. They were both quiet. He's going to go to the other families next, Gideon said. The ones who got letters. He'll make the same implication, and some of them will take it. Some of them might not have a choice, Vivian said, if the debt is real enough to them, or if they don't have the receipts we have. Tom Dunnett doesn't keep good records, Gideon said. He never has. Vivian thought about the list on the table, 11 families, the timeline of sales, the pattern of it. We need to get to the registry office, she said, before he does whatever he's going to do next. Gideon nodded. He was already somewhere in the thinking that came after the decision. She could see that. I'll go Monday, he said. We'll go Monday, Vivian said. He looked at her. Vivian, you're going to need someone who can read a ledger at a speed that matters, she said, and someone who's been a telegraph operator and knows how offices work. She paused. And possibly someone who can be unpleasant to clerks without it looking like a threat. Something flickered in his expression. You can do that? I have a very pleasant face, she said. It's useful. He almost smiled again, more visible this time than the one in the lamplight, more like the beginning of something. Monday, he said. Both of us. Cora appeared in the doorway again. She had clearly been in the hallway. Again. I want to come, she said. No, Gideon said. Cora. His voice was firm, not unkind, but firm. You're staying here with Eli. I need you to look after him, and I need to know you're here. She looked like she was going to argue. Then she looked at Vivian. Vivian said, I'll tell you everything that happens. Everything, not the simplified version. Cora studied her. Promise? Yes. She held for another moment. Fine, she said. But she looked at her father when she said it, and what was in her face was not just reluctant agreement. It was something more careful than that. Something that had been calibrated over 14 months of watching her father not be fully present, and was now, slowly and not without wariness, considering the possibility that he might be coming back. He saw it. She could tell he saw it by the way he looked at his daughter, that particular look that parents get when their children reveal that they have been seen more clearly than the parents realized. I'll be back by Wednesday, he told her. I know, Cora said. Before Monday came, Margaret came back. She came with information, not food, which was, Vivian had come to understand, Margaret at her most serious. She sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in her precise handwriting, and she read from it without preamble. The Dunnetts got a letter, she said, 6 weeks ago. Tom didn't tell anyone because he was embarrassed. The Pettigrews got one 8 weeks ago and already paid a partial settlement because their youngest is sick, and Elsa didn't want the added worry. The Coopers haven't gotten a letter, but Carl Cooper sold to Webb last spring. He told me he'd been having fence problems for a year before that, and someone cut his water line twice, and he couldn't prove who. She set the paper down. That's what I could confirm in 2 days. I think there are more. The table was quiet. 11 families on the rail line, Vivian said, looking at Cora's list. You've accounted for 4. If the pattern holds, the pattern holds, Margaret said flatly. Carl Cooper told me Webb's man Pruitt was at the county office when he went in to report the fence problems. Just there, having a coffee with the clerk. Gideon looked at the table. That's enough, he said. That's enough for what? It's enough to show a pattern, Vivian said. It's not enough to prove it to anyone official. For that we need the original records. Then you go get them, Margaret said, looking directly at Vivian. Not with hostility. with something Vivian would have called an alliance if she'd believed it had fully arrived yet. Maybe it was close. Sunday night, Vivian sat at the table after everyone was in bed and wrote a letter. Not a fraudulent one, a careful one, addressed to the Territorial Land Oversight Office in the capital, laying out the pattern of what they'd found with the specificity she'd learned keeping accounts. She cited dates, names, amounts. She used the language she'd learned from 2 years of telegraphs and 3 years of bakery accounts. Clean, precise, without embellishment. She sealed it and addressed it and left it on the table to go out on the Monday stage. Then she sat there a moment in the quiet. She thought about what she had come for. A room, work, somewhere to be useful. She had not come for this. She was not, by nature or by training, someone who investigated railroad syndicates or challenged county registry offices. She was a woman who had managed accounts and telegraphs and bread and had arrived on a train because a 10-year-old girl had been desperate enough to forge a letter. But she was here. And this was what was in front of her. She heard a sound from the hall and looked up. Gideon was in the doorway. He did that, appeared in rooms silently, just existing in them, waiting to see if they would have him. He looked at the sealed letter. "Who'd you write to?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter, and then he looked at her. "You didn't ask me first," he said. "No," she said. "I should have." He thought about that. "No," he said finally. "I would have said let's wait and see what we find in Harlan first, which would have been 1 more week gone." "Yes," Vivian said. He pulled out a chair and sat. He put his elbows on the table and his hands over his face, and he sat like that for a moment. Not dramatically, just like a man who was tired and was briefly not hiding it. "This ranch," he said from behind his hands. "Eleanor and I built it from 40 acres in a broken-down house. We spent 12 years making it something. She'd been saving to fix the north roof the year she got sick." He dropped his hands. "I can't lose it." "We're not going to lose it," Vivian said. "You don't know that." "No," she said, "but I know we have the receipts, and we have the pattern, and we have Margaret Hale, which is not nothing." He looked at her. "She used to drive me to drink," he said. "For the first 5 years I knew her." "I know," Vivian said. "She told me." He blinked. "She told you that?" "She said you used to argue about everything, and Eleanor thought it was funny." A pause. "She misses her too. You know that." He was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "I know." "She's fighting for this place because Eleanor loved it," Vivian said. "That matters." He sat for a moment more. The lamp was low. The wind was there again, consistent and cold, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way of places that have absorbed a lot of living. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." "The name you gave Webb," he said. "Vivian Hale." She met his eyes. "Yes." "Was that tactical?" "Partly," she said honestly. "And the other part?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "I've been in this house for 5 weeks," she said. "I fixed the shelf and the window and the ledger. I got up twice in the night for your son, and I sat with your daughter until she remembered she was allowed to be a child sometimes. I'm going to Harlan with you Monday to fight for land that isn't in my name." She looked at him steadily. "It felt true when I said it." Gideon looked at her for a long time. "It is true," he said. "If you want it to be." The way he said it was not a declaration. It was not a proposal in any traditional sense. It was just a man who didn't use words carelessly being very deliberate about this particular set of them. She held his gaze. "I want it to be," she said. He nodded. "Once. Slow and certain." "Then it is," he said. He went to bed. She sat at the table a moment longer. The letter was there, sealed and addressed and ready for the stage. The list of 11 families was there. The receipts were in the strongbox in the bedroom. Monday was coming. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Blackstone Ridge, she didn't lie awake listening to the ridge wind and calculating contingencies. She slept. Outside, the valley was dark and cold, and whatever was coming was already in motion. But for this one night, the house on the ridge was warm and quiet, and everyone in it was resting. That was something worth protecting. She intended to protect it. The road to Harlan was 40 miles of frozen dirt, and Gideon didn't talk much, which she had expected, and the wagon axle made a sound somewhere around the 15-mile mark, that made them both look at each other and then look away and not discuss it, which she had also come to expect. What she hadn't expected was that he would talk about Eleanor. It happened around the 20-mile mark, when the ridge had dropped behind them and the land opened up into that particular flat expanse that feels like the world has run out of opinions. He was looking straight ahead at the horse's ears, and he said, without preamble, "She would have liked you." Vivian didn't say anything. She waited. She didn't have patience for people who couldn't think on their feet, he said. She used to say most people were decorative. She didn't mean it cruelly. She just valued people who could do things. He was quiet for a moment. The telegraph operator thing would have impressed her. She had a thing about women doing work that people said they couldn't do. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Vivian said. "She was," he said, simply, without the wreckage underneath it that she'd heard in his voice when he talked about Eleanor before. Not because the grief was gone, it wasn't, she knew that, but like maybe he'd found a way to hold it that didn't require him to put everything else down first. They didn't talk again for another 10 miles, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one before. Harlan was larger than Blackstone Ridge by a factor that reminded Vivian she had, in fact, once lived in a city. It had a proper main street with buildings that had second floors and an actual hotel with a sign that had not faded past legibility, and a land registry office that occupied a stone building on the east end of the street with the particular permanence of institutions that want you to feel small before you walk in. Vivian straightened her coat before they went in. Old habit. The clerk behind the counter was a young man with a precise part in his hair and the expression of someone who had been taught that efficiency was a virtue and had taken the lesson further than intended. His nameplate said R. Hollis. "Can I help you?" he said, in the tone of someone who would prefer not to. "We're here to review the tax records for a property in the Blackstone Ridge area," Vivian said. "Hale Ranch, Lot 14, Section 7 of the Harlan County Survey." Hollis looked at her, then at Gideon, then back at her. "Records requests require a formal application," he said. "Of course," Vivian said. She had expected this. "We'd like to make one." "Processing takes 2 to 3 weeks. We have a 60-day notice of delinquency," Vivian said, and she set the letter on the counter, flat and clear, with the Harlan County Registry stamp visible, "which was issued from this office. We'd like to compare the records on file here with the payment receipts we've brought, and we'd like to do it today." Hollis looked at the letter. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like the look of someone who recognizes a document they didn't expect to see produced. "I'd have to speak to the supervising registrar," he said. "Please do," Vivian said pleasantly. He disappeared into the back room. Gideon leaned toward her slightly and said, under his breath, "Very pleasant face." "I told you," she said. The supervising registrar was a man named Oswald, who was approximately 60 and had the look of someone who had been in bureaucratic positions long enough to have developed a sixth sense for trouble. He came out of the back room looking at them with that sense fully deployed. Vivian explained the situation. She laid out the receipts, 2 years of them, organized by quarter, dated and stamped by the registry's own receiving clerk, and she laid out the delinquency notice beside them, and she explained clearly and without accusation the discrepancy between the two. Oswald looked at the receipts for a long time. "These are our stamps," he said. "Yes," Vivian said. "They are. The records in our system show." "I understand what the records in your system show," Vivian said. "I'm asking you to look at what the physical receipts show, which are also your records, and tell me how those two things can both be true." Oswald looked at her. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the receipts again, and something in his face changed. Not the guilt of a man who had done something, but the discomfort of a man who was beginning to understand that something had been done around him. "Give me an hour," he said. He took the receipts into the back room and closed the door. They waited in the hard chairs along the wall. Gideon sat with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands. Vivian sat straight and still, because sitting straight and still was something she could control. After 40 minutes, a different man came out of the back. Older than Hollis, heavier, with the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had had a lot of practice. He introduced himself as Garrett, deputy registrar, and he sat down across from them in the waiting area rather than behind the counter, which was the first thing that felt off. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I understand you're concerned about some discrepancies." "I'm not concerned about discrepancies," Gideon said. I'm concerned about why my land is under seizure notice when I've paid every tax on time for 7 years. These things do sometimes involve clerical. Were you in this office when Aldous Webb's representative came in to request the audit? Vivian said. Garrett went very still. It had been a guess, a directed one based on what Margaret had told them about Cooper's experience, about Pruitt being present in the county office when problems appeared. But it was still a guess, and she had said it with the certainty of a fact, and she watched Garrett's stillness and knew she had landed somewhere real. I process a great number of Deputy Commissioner Pruitt, Vivian said. Has he been in this office in the last 3 months? The stillness again. A different quality this time. Gideon said, I think we'd like to speak to Oswald again. Garrett stood up, and his face had rearranged itself into something smooth and careful, and he said there was nothing further the office could assist with at this time, and that the formal application process was available at the counter, and he went back behind the door. They sat in the waiting room. We're not going to get the records today, Gideon said. No, Vivian said, but we got something. What? We got Garrett, she said. And Garrett knows something, and now he knows we know he knows something, and that changes what he does next. She stood. And we got Oswald looking at the receipts. He's not dirty. I don't think he's dirty. He's confused and he's uncomfortable, and he's going to keep thinking about those receipts after we leave. That's not enough, Gideon said. Not yet, she agreed. Come on, I need to find the telegraph office. He looked at her. Why? Because I want to send a message to the Territorial Oversight Office before their mail does, she said. The telegraph office was 3 buildings down. The operator was a woman of about 40, with quick hands and the slightly distant expression of someone who spent most of their day with other people's words moving through them. She looked at Vivian's message and quoted a price, and Vivian paid it without argument. The message was addressed to the office of the Territorial Land Commissioner and referenced the letter Vivian had sent on Sunday and provided 3 specific receipt numbers from the Hale payments as evidence of paid taxes falsely recorded as delinquent, and requested an immediate hold on any property action pending investigation. The operator sent it. Vivian watched her hands and felt the old familiar competence of it, the rhythm, the precision, and for a moment she was 24 again, and faster than the men, and had not yet learned that being faster didn't always help you keep the job. 12 words a minute, the operator said when the message had gone. Vivian looked at her. 18, at my best. The woman raised her eyebrows. Where'd you work? Missouri Pacific Line, before the consolidation. I was Burlington Northern, the woman said, before my hands gave out. She flexed her right hand briefly, a gesture that had the quality of something old and accepted. You want a copy of the scent confirmation? Please, Vivian said. They had the confirmation and they were back in the wagon before noon, and the road back was colder than the road in because the wind had come around from the north. What happens now? Gideon said. Now we go home and we wait for 2 things, Vivian said. Either Oswald finds his spine and pulls the actual records, or the territorial office responds to the letter and the telegraph. She paused. And we talk to the other families. The Dunnettes, he said. Pettigrews. And whoever else Margaret's found, she said. We need all of them to pull their receipts. Every payment record they have. If the pattern is what we think it is, there will be the same discrepancy in every file. Payments recorded locally, but not entered in the county system. That's not a clerical error. That's a pattern. Gideon drove for a while without speaking. The wagon axle made its sound again around the same spot as before. I need to apologize to you, he said. She looked at him. For what? For the station, he said, the first day. I stood there and let Margaret speak for me, and I didn't say anything. You'd come all the way from Cincinnati on the strength of a letter, and I stood there. You were surprised, she said. I was, he said, but that's not the whole of it. The truth is, I wasn't ready for anyone to be there. I hadn't been ready for anything for a long time. He kept his eyes on the road. I've been thinking about what Cora said, that I was working to avoid thinking, that I wasn't living, I was waiting. He was quiet. She was right. She's almost always right, which is either a blessing or a problem. I haven't decided. Both, Vivian said. He made a sound that was very close to a laugh. Both, he agreed. She got it from someone, Vivian said. He glanced at her. She looked back at him, and this time he did laugh, short, rough, genuine, the laugh of a man who hasn't done it in a while and is slightly surprised by the experience. They got back to Blackstone Ridge as the sun was dropping and Cora was on the porch before the wagon stopped, with Eli beside her pretending he hadn't been watching for them from the window. Vivian told Cora everything. She had promised, and she kept the promise. Sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with the oil lamp between them, telling her about Hollis and Oswald and Garrett's stillness and the telegraph office. Cora listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands and asked 2 questions, both exactly right. "Do you think Oswald will do something?" she said. "I think he might," Vivian said. "He was genuinely bothered by those receipts. People who've been doing something wrong don't look bothered when evidence appears. They look careful. He looked bothered." Cora nodded slowly. "And Garrett?" "Garrett is going to tell someone we were there," Vivian said, "which means Webb will know by the end of the week." Cora looked at her. "Is that bad?" "It means we have less time than we thought," Vivian said. "But it also means they know we're not going to quietly disappear, which changes their calculation." Cora thought about this. "They might try something else," she said. "Yes," Vivian said. "They might." "Like what?" Vivian was honest. "I don't know yet. That's what I'm thinking about." Gideon, from across the room where he'd been listening without appearing to listen, said, "They already tried the tax records. If that doesn't push us out—" "They go for something harder to fight," Vivian said. "Reputation, water rights, something that takes longer to prove wrong." The table was quiet. Eli, who had been drawing horses on a scrap of paper with determined concentration, and whom everyone had slightly forgotten was in the room, looked up and said, "Can't you just tell everybody what they're doing?" 3 adults looked at him. "I mean," he said, with the specificity of a 6-year-old who has been listening carefully, "if they're lying about everybody's taxes, that's a lot of people who have the same problem. And if everybody knows they have the same problem, then it's not just you against the railroad men. It's everybody." The kitchen was very quiet. Gideon looked at his son. Eli looked back at him, slightly uncertain now about whether he'd said something wrong. "That's—" Gideon started. "That's exactly right," Vivian said. Eli relaxed and went back to his horses. Cora was already looking at her list. It took 3 days and Margaret's social architecture, which was considerable, to get 8 families together in the Blackstone Ridge Church Hall on a Thursday evening. Not all 11. The Coopers had already sold, and 2 other families were too frightened to come. But 8 families, 16 adults, sitting in the uneven wooden chairs of the hall, with the kind of tension in the air that comes when people have been carrying the same worry separately and have just discovered they're not alone in it. Vivian had not planned to be the one who spoke. She had thought Gideon should. It was his community, his relationships, his land. But Gideon had looked at her before they went in and said, "You know the shape of it better than I do. The receipts, the pattern, the registry office. You explain it." She had said she wasn't sure that was wise, a woman from Cincinnati explaining the land situation to people who'd lived here their whole lives. He had said, "They don't care where you're from. They care whether you know what you're talking about." She had thought about that and decided he was right. So she stood at the front of the church hall with Cora's list and the receipts and what she'd learned in Harlan, and she laid it out, clearly, plainly, without embellishment, the way she'd learned to explain accounts. The pattern of the land purchases. The timing of the tax notices relative to when families had refused Webb's offers. Garrett's stillness when she'd mentioned Pruitt. The physical receipts that contradicted the electronic county records. The room was very quiet while she talked. Tom Dunnett, who was a large, weathered man who had clearly been embarrassed about being in this situation, spoke first when she finished. How do we know you've got the right of it?" he said. Not aggressively. He seemed genuinely uncertain whether he was allowed to hope that someone had the right of it. "You have receipts," Vivian said. "Pull them. Look at the dates and amounts. Match them against what the county notice says you owe. If your receipts show what you paid and the county says you didn't, then you have the same thing we have." "And then what?" said a woman in the second row. Elsa Pettigrew, whose youngest was sick, who had already paid a partial settlement she couldn't afford. Vivian thought about that. She thought about the territorial oversight letter, the telegraph, Oswald in the back room with the receipts. "Then you have evidence," she said. "And evidence shared across 8 families is not the same as evidence held by one. It's harder to dismiss, harder to suppress, and considerably harder to make disappear." The room considered that. Gideon, who had been leaning against the wall at the back, spoke then. Not loudly. He never spoke loudly, but in the room's silence it carried. "I'm not going to tell any of you what to do," he said. "Some of you have sick kids. Some of you have debts I don't know about. Some of you are tired, and you've got good reason to be tired, and Webb's money looks real, and this—" He gestured toward Vivian, toward the list, toward all of it. "Looks like a fight you didn't sign up for." He paused. "But I'm not selling," he said. "My wife and I built that ranch for 12 years, and my kids are going to inherit it, and I'm not selling it to a syndicate that forged my tax records to force my hand." He looked around the room. "Whoever wants to stand with us, we'd be glad to have you. Whoever can't, I understand that too. But I wanted you to know where we are." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him give. She watched the room. Something shifted in it. The way things shift when a person says a true thing without flinching from it. Tom Dunnett said, "I've got my receipts." Elsa Pettigrew said quietly, "So do we." By the end of the evening, 6 of the 8 families had agreed to pull their records and compile them. Margaret had offered her parlor for the compilation meeting on Saturday. The Dunnett boy, who was 17 and apparently very fast on a horse, had been dispatched to ask the remaining families who hadn't come. Walking back to the wagon after, Gideon walked beside Vivian, and she felt the cold ridge air and the particular exhaustion of having been present for something that mattered, and she thought about Eli's voice in the kitchen, "If everybody knows they have the same problem," and felt something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it. "You were good in there," Gideon said. "You were better," she said. "I just told the truth," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." He looked at her sidelong. She could feel it without turning her head. "Margaret told me something," he said. "What did she tell you?" "She told me she was wrong," he said. "About you." She said it in about 30 words when she could have said it in 5, which is Margaret, but she said it. "She's coming around in her own way," Vivian said. "She is," he said, slowly and with a great deal of dignity. A pause. "She also told me she's glad Cora wrote the letter." Vivian stopped walking. Gideon stopped beside her. The street was empty, the lamplight thin and yellow from the store windows, and the ridge was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky. "She said Cora did what Eleanor would have done," he said. "Eleanor never waited for permission either." Vivian looked at him. He was looking at the ridge. His face in the cold, thin light was tired and honest, and she had been learning it for 6 weeks now, and she thought she knew most of it. "Are you glad she wrote it?" she said. He turned and looked at her, direct and clear, the way he looked when he had decided what he thought. "Yes," he said, without qualification, without the complicated layering that might have surrounded it 2 weeks ago. Just yes, simple and complete. She nodded. They walked back to the wagon. Saturday brought Margaret's parlor and 6 families' worth of receipts spread across every flat surface, and Cora in the middle of it, 12 years old in her competence if not her age, directing the organization of documents with a precision that made Tom Dunnett, at one point, actually step back and defer to her, which Vivian noted and filed away as something she would tell Cora about when the day was done. The pattern was undeniable by noon. Every family had paid. Every family had receipts with legitimate registry stamps. And in every file in the county system, they had gotten copies, painstakingly, through a contact of Margaret's in the assessor's office, who had decided this was above his comfort level and had produced the records with the expression of a man hoping to be forgotten. In every file, the payments simply were not recorded, not misrecorded, not entered wrong, just absent, as if they had been received and then erased. "That's not an accident," Tom Dunnett said, looking at his own receipts beside the gap in the county records. "No," Vivian said. "Someone at the county is doing this deliberately." "Someone at the county," she said. "Or someone with access to someone at the county." "Pruitt," Gideon said. "Pruitt," Vivian confirmed. She had a document by 3 in the afternoon. Not a legal brief, she was not a lawyer, but a clear, organized account of what the evidence showed, signed by 6 families, with a full copy of all receipts and the corresponding county records showing the erasures. She made 2 copies by hand. One would go to the Territorial Oversight Office to accompany the letter and telegraph she'd already sent. One she gave to Margaret. "Why me?" Margaret said. "Because if something happens to our copy," Vivian said, You're the last person they'd expect to have one. Margaret looked at the document. Then she looked at Vivian. You think they'd try to take it from you, she said. I think Garrett told Webb we were in Harlan, Vivian said. And I think Webb is not a man who makes 50-mile wagon trips for nothing. He'll be back. Margaret looked at the document again. She held it for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something you understand the weight of. All right, she said. She put it in her jacket. Webb came back on a Monday. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He came to Main Street, and he came with two men Vivian hadn't seen before, large, quiet men who stood at distances that were not aggressive but were not casual either. He went to the general store, and he went to the livery, and he stood outside the church hall for a long moment looking at it, and Blackstone Ridge watched him do all of this with the particular attention of a small town that has decided it has an opinion. Vivian watched from this kitchen window. Cora stood beside her. He knows, she said. Yes, Vivian said. What does he do now? He reassesses, Vivian said. He thought this was going to be easy. Families getting letters in the mail, not knowing what to do, taking the money because the money was real, and the problem looked unsolvable. She watched Webb stop in front of the general store and look at the street. Now he knows we've been to the registry office, and we've talked to the other families, and we've sent evidence to the Territorial Commission. That changes his arithmetic. Does it stop him? Cora said. Vivian was honest. I don't know. Webb didn't come to the ranch that day, or the next. On Wednesday, Vivian got a response from the Territorial Oversight Office. Brief, official, and exactly what she had needed it to be. The office had received her complaint. A reviewing officer had been assigned. All property actions in the named dispute would be suspended pending investigation. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and sat down, because her legs felt slightly unreliable. Gideon read it over her shoulder. He put his hand on her shoulder. Not dramatically, not with declaration, just set it there, warm and steady, and left it for a moment. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a long moment, looking at a letter that was not the end of anything. Investigations took time, and Pruitt was still somewhere and Webb was still somewhere, and none of it was resolved. But that was the first official acknowledgement that something had been done wrong and someone was going to look at it. Cora, Gideon called. She appeared in the doorway in approximately 4 seconds, which suggested she had been very nearby. He held out the letter. She took it and read it. Her face while she read was the most carefully controlled thing Vivian had ever seen on a child. Then she looked up and something cracked through that control. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a sudden brightness in her eyes that she blinked hard against. Okay, she said. Okay, Gideon agreed. Eli came in from outside and looked at the three of them standing around the table looking at a piece of paper and said, Did something good happen or did something bad happen because everyone's face is doing something weird? Something good, Vivian said. How good? Very good, Cora said, and her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, and she cleared her throat with great dignity and handed Eli the letter, which he held right side up in the manner of someone who could not yet read it but understood it was important. Gerald should know about this, he said seriously, which referred to the fence post, and Cora made the small, exasperated sound that was becoming Vivian's favorite sound in the world, and Gideon made a low sound in his chest that was unmistakably a laugh, and the kitchen on the ridge was warm and loud and imperfect and full. Outside, whatever was coming was still coming. Webb was still in the valley, and Pruitt was still somewhere, and the investigation had barely begun, and there were miles yet to go. But the oversight office had said stop, and 6 families had signed a document, and the receipts were real. And for the first time since a train had pulled into Blackstone Ridge, and a woman with $43 and a bad knee had stepped onto the platform into the worst welcome of her life, the shape of the thing ahead looked more like a fight they could win than a hole they were falling into. Gideon looked at her across the table, across the letter, across Eli's interpretation of Gerald's entitlement to good news. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The investigating officer from the Territorial Oversight Office arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Vivian's telegraph had gone out, and he was not what anyone had expected. His name was Clarence Hobb. He was 60-something, small, wore a coat that had been good 20 years ago and was now simply familiar and he stepped off the stage at Blackstone Ridge with a leather satchel and the unhurried expression of a man who had seen a great many things and had learned that urgency was mostly theater. He asked Pell at the station where the Hale Ranch was, got directions, and walked there without asking anyone to take him, which was the first sign that he was not going to be managed. Vivian was in the kitchen when she heard the knock and opened the door to find him standing on the porch, looking at the ridge with his hands in his pockets. "Mrs. Hale," he said, without turning around immediately. "That's quite a view." "It is," she said. He turned then and looked at her with the specific attention of someone assembling information. "You wrote the letter," he said. "And the telegraph," she said. "Yes." He reached into his satchel and produced her letter, which had been annotated in the margins in a small, precise hand. "You used to work telegraph?" "Missouri Pacific, before the consolidation." He came inside when she stepped back, looked at the kitchen the same way he'd looked at the ridge, not intrusively, just observing. "Is Mr. Hale here?" "South pasture," she said. "I can send for him." "Give me an hour with you first," Hobbs said. He sat down at the table like he'd been there before. "Walk me through the receipts." She walked him through the receipts. He asked 7 questions in the course of an hour, each one arriving after a silence that meant he'd been thinking, and each one landing precisely on the thing she'd been least certain about in her account. He was not a friendly man, not unfriendly either, just neutral in the way of someone who had trained themselves out of preference because preference got in the way. But he listened with his whole attention, and that was something she had learned to value more than warmth. When she finished, he sat for a moment with her documentation spread in front of him. "The erasures in the county records," he said. "You're certain they're erasures and not simply missing entries?" "The column formatting shows where entries should be," she said. "The spacing is wrong in each delinquent account, slightly compressed, like lines were removed. I noticed it first in ours. Then I checked the Dunnett file and the Pettigrew file, and it was the same." She paused. "I was a telegraph operator, not a document examiner. But I know what an account looks like when something's been taken out of it." Hobb looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think you probably do." Gideon came in from the south pasture 40 minutes later. Cora had gone to get him, running the whole way because Cora did not do things slowly when they mattered. And he came in with his hat in his hands and the specific alertness of a man who had been thinking about this moment for 3 weeks. He and Hobb shook hands and took each other's measure in the way that men do when they are both, in different ways, accustomed to being the person who reads a room. "I'm going to need to go to Harlan," Hobb said, "to the registry office. I'm going to need to see the original ledgers, not the copies your families have, the originals in the county system." "Garrett won't let you see them," Gideon said. "Garrett doesn't have a choice," Hobb said mildly. "I have a territorial commission warrant. The county office is obligated to produce any records requested under official investigation." He looked at his satchel. "Garrett may make it uncomfortable. He will not be able to make it impossible." "Pruitt," Vivian said. "Deputy Land Commissioner Pruitt. He'll know you're coming." "He already knows I'm coming," Hobb said. "I sent his office a formal notification of investigation 14 days ago. That's required procedure." He looked at her. "People like Pruitt generally spend those 14 days doing one of 2 things. Either they destroy evidence, which tells you a great deal, or they lawyer up and go quiet, which also tells you a great deal." He paused. "Pruitt sent me a letter 4 days ago expressing his full cooperation and confidence in the integrity of the county land records." "That's the third option," Vivian said. "Yes," Hobb said. "The third option is they get out ahead of it, which means he's not certain what I have." He looked at the receipts on the table. "He's about to find out." He left for Harlan the next morning, alone, with the satchel and Vivian's full documentation and 6 families' worth of receipts. He told them he would be in touch, and he used the word weeks, not days, and he said it without apology, which was somehow reassuring, the reassurance of someone who was not promising things he couldn't deliver. Webb was still in the valley. That was the uncomfortable fact that Hobbs' arrival did not change. Webb had taken a room at the Norris boarding house indefinitely, and he moved through Blackstone Ridge with the patient, pleasant air of a man who had decided to wait out the weather. He stopped people on the street. He had coffee at the general store. He was never threatening and never specific, just present. A reminder that he was still there and the offer was still on the table, and investigations took time, and time was something not everyone could afford. Tom Dunnett came to the ranch on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after Hobb had gone to Harlan. He stood on the porch with his hat going through his hands the same way Gideon's did when he was working through something difficult. And he said, without quite meeting anyone's eyes, "Webb came to my place yesterday." Gideon said, "What did he say?" He said the investigation was going to take 6 months minimum, and the tax notice wouldn't wait, and he could make the notice disappear if I signed the transfer. Tom looked at the porch boards. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was sorry about the whole situation. The porch was quiet. "What did you tell him?" Vivian asked. Tom was quiet for a moment. "I told him I needed to think." He finally looked up. "My youngest has been sick 3 months. The medical bills are, I'm not going to lie to you, it's bad. And $400 looks real when you're holding it, and an investigation looks like words on paper." Vivian looked at him. She thought about Elsa Pettigrew's face at the church hall, the already paid partial settlement, the sick child. She thought about what it actually cost people to stand up when the standing was this hard. "Tom," Gideon said, "if you have to sell, I understand that." Tom looked at him sharply. "You'd understand that." "You've got a sick kid," Gideon said. "That's not the same as a tax notice. That's different." He said it plainly, without judgment. "I'm not going to ask you to lose your son's health for the sake of a land dispute." Tom Dunnett's jaw worked for a moment. "It's not just a land dispute," he said. It's not just land. It's everything I built. It's everything Ruth and I—" He stopped. "I just needed to tell somebody that it's hard," he said. "I didn't come here for permission. I came because it's hard and I needed someone to know that." "I know that," Gideon said. They stood on the porch in the cold for another moment. "Don't sign anything yet," Vivian said. "Give it 2 more weeks. If Hobb finds what I think he's going to find, the tax notice goes away. If he doesn't, you haven't lost anything by waiting 2 weeks." Tom looked at her. He'd been skeptical of her at the church hall. She'd felt it, the particular skepticism of a man who wasn't sure he trusted the woman from Cincinnati to understand what was at stake. She thought maybe he'd moved some distance from that. 2 weeks, he said. He left. Gideon watched him go down the track and then turned and leaned against the porch post with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing it did when he was carrying something heavy. "He might still sell," he said. "He might," Vivian said. "That's his right. If he sells, the Rileys will sell. They follow whatever Tom does." He looked at the valley. "If the Rileys go, Webb has enough of a corridor to make his case to the investors without us. He doesn't need to wait for the investigation." "I know," she said. "So we need Hobb to move faster than 2 weeks." "We can't make Hobb move faster," she said. "He moves at his own pace, and that's why he's good at what he does." Gideon was quiet. "What can we do?" She had been thinking about this since Tom Dunnett had appeared on the porch. "We can go back to Harlan," she said. "Not to the registry office, to the newspaper." He looked at her. "Webb is working quietly because quiet is how this works," she said. 6 families getting individual letters in the mail, each one thinking they're alone, each one too embarrassed or too scared to talk. That's the mechanism. It only works in the dark." She looked at him. "A story in the Harlan Courier about a land syndicate falsifying county tax records across an entire valley doesn't stay in the dark." Gideon was quiet for a long time. He turned his hat through his hands. "That's a risk," he said. "If Hobb hasn't confirmed anything yet, and we go to a newspaper, Webb could say it's slander, could come after us legally." "He could," she said, "if we made accusations. But we don't have to make accusations. We have receipts. We have dates. We have 6 signatures on a document that says this is what we found, and this is what the county records show. Facts aren't slander." He looked at her for another long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the porch," she said. He almost smiled. It was getting easier to find the shape of it now. "Let's go to Harlan," he said. They went to Harlan the next day, and this time Cora came with them, because Cora had produced, with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated this conversation, a written argument for why she should be there that was so precisely constructed that Gideon had read it twice and then looked at Vivian and said, "I don't know where she gets this from." And Vivian had said nothing and looked at the window. The Harlan Courier was on the west end of the main street, a narrow building that smelled of ink and paper and the particular organized chaos of a working press. The editor was a woman named Frances Cade, which was the first surprise, and the second surprise was that she had been expecting someone to walk through that door eventually. "I've been hearing things," she said before Vivian had finished her introduction, "about Webb, about the land purchases. I heard there was a woman from somewhere east who went to the registry office 3 weeks ago and made Garrett very nervous." "That was me," Vivian said. Frances looked at her with frank professional interest. "Do you have documentation?" Vivian set it on the desk. Frances read it. She read it the way journalists read things, quickly, efficiently, stopping to reread specific parts. She looked at the receipts. She looked at the county record copies. She looked at the 6 signatures. "And there's a territorial investigator in town?" she said. "He's been here 2 weeks, Vivian said. "I can't speak to what he's found, but he came with a commission warrant and he's been in the registry office." Frances nodded slowly. She looked at Cora, who was sitting in the chair beside Vivian with her hands in her lap, and an expression of focused calm that Frances seemed to find notable. "This your daughter?" she said to Vivian. Vivian looked at Cora. Cora looked at Vivian. Something passed between them that was by now familiar. The shorthand of 2 people who have been in a house together long enough to understand each other without the full sentence. "Yes," Vivian said. Cora didn't say anything, but something in her face, very briefly, was the opposite of her careful composure. It was open and young and completely unguarded, and then it was gone and the composure was back. Frances looked between them and made the small nod of someone filing information away. "I'm going to need to verify independently," she said. "I don't print accusations, but if what you've brought me holds up, and it looks like it holds up, this is not a small story." She looked at the receipts again. "This is a story about a railroad syndicate systematically defrauding homesteaders across a county. That's not local news. That's territorial news." "Will it run in time?" Gideon said. Frances looked at him. "Time for what?" "We have neighbors who are about to sell because they can't afford to wait," he said. "If this runs before they sign—" "I can have something in the Thursday edition," Frances said. "That's 5 days." She looked at Vivian. "Will your investigator have found something by then?" "I don't know," Vivian said honestly, "but I think so." Hobb found something on Wednesday. He found it in the original ledger books in the county registry basement, which Garrett had initially claimed were archived and inaccessible, and which Hobb had produced his commission warrant to access, and which turned out to contain, in the entries covering the previous 26 months, a systematic pattern of payment entries being marked as received and then overwritten in a different ink. Not erased, overwritten. Someone had gone through the ledger books and changed received to pending in dozens of entries across more than a dozen accounts. And whoever had done it had not been as careful in the physical books as they had been in the cleaner county system records, because ink doesn't lie the way a system record can. Hobb came to the boarding house where Vivian and Gideon and Cora were staying, and he sat down and he laid it out without ceremony. "Pruitt signed off on the audit request," he said, "the request that triggered all the delinquency notices. I have the original request in his handwriting." He paused. "The overwriting in the ledgers was done by Garrett." Garrett, who had gone very still when Vivian mentioned Pruitt's name, who had come out of the back room with the smooth face of someone practicing being unreadable. "Garrett was working for them," Gideon said. "Garrett was working for someone," Hobb said, "whether directly for Webb or through Pruitt. That's for the commission to determine. But the evidence of what was done is clear." He looked at his satchel. "I'm filing for a full commission review of all property actions tied to these accounts. Every delinquency notice issued against any of the families in your documentation is suspended as of today. The tax debt that was used as leverage against you, it doesn't exist. It never existed." The room was very quiet. Vivian heard the words and felt them land and didn't trust them immediately because she had learned not to trust things that sounded like relief until relief had proven itself durable. "Webb," she said. "What happens to Webb?" "Webb is a businessman," Hobb said. "The question is whether he knew the mechanism being used to generate the pressure on your families. If he did, he's complicit. If he didn't—" He paused. "Frankly, a man of his intelligence and this level of orchestration, I find it unlikely he didn't know. But proving that is a different matter from proving what Garrett and Pruitt did." "Will he be prosecuted?" Gideon said. "Garrett and Pruitt, yes," Hobb said. "Certainly. Webb—" He made a gesture that was honest about its uncertainty. He'll lose the land acquisitions. Every purchase made during the period of fraudulent pressure will be reviewed. The families who sold under duress will have recourse to challenge those sales. He looked at Gideon. Your land is yours. That's not uncertain. Gideon sat with that for a moment. He put his hands on the table. He looked at them. The hands of someone who had been working land for 20 years, who had built something with them and nearly lost it to a man with a briefcase and a friendly smile and a corrupt deputy commissioner in his pocket. Okay, he said. It was the same word Cora had used when she'd read the oversight letter. Vivian noticed that. The Thursday edition of the Harlan Courier ran with a headline that stretched across the top of the front page. Frances Cade had not exaggerated when she said this was not a local story. She had worked her sources for 5 days, and she had found 2 more families in adjacent counties who had received the same pattern of letters, which meant the syndicate's operation extended well beyond Blackstone Ridge. And she said so with the precision of a woman who understood the difference between what she could prove and what she suspected, and was careful only to print the former. The story traveled. That was the word people used. It traveled. The territorial papers picked it up within a week. The commission review that Hobb had filed became a full commission investigation with 3 additional officers assigned. Pruitt was suspended within 10 days and formally charged within 3 weeks. Garrett resigned from the registry office on the day the Courier story ran and was arrested 5 days later. Webb left Blackstone Ridge quietly, on the early stage, without telling anyone he was going. Claire Norris found out when she went to collect his bill and discovered he'd settled it the night before and left a very polite note. She told Margaret this at the general store, and Margaret told Vivian, and Vivian stood at the kitchen window and felt something release in her that she hadn't fully known was held. The Dunnett family did not sell. Tom came back to the ranch the day after the story ran with the paper folded under his arm and the look of a man who had slept better than he had in months. I owe you an apology, he said. You don't, Vivian said. I doubted you, he said. When you first spoke at the hall, I thought you were someone who didn't understand what was actually at stake. You were protecting your family, she said. That's not something to apologize for. Tom was quiet for a moment. Your husband made a speech at the hall, he said, about how he wasn't going to tell anyone what to do, about his wife building the ranch for 12 years. He paused. I've known Gideon Hale for 9 years, and I've never heard him say that many words in a row. Vivian looked across the yard to where Gideon was working the fence line, which he had been doing since early morning, with the focused energy of a man who finally had something to work toward instead of away from. He had something worth saying, she said. The commission's formal findings came through 6 weeks after Hobb had left Blackstone Ridge. The document was long and official and detailed, and what it meant in plain terms was this. Every fraudulent delinquency notice issued across the valley was void. Every family who had paid a partial settlement under the fraudulent notices was entitled to full restitution. 3 families who had sold their land under documented duress, including the Coopers, who had lived with cut water lines and fence problems for a year before taking Webb's money, were entitled to challenge those sales, and the commission would facilitate those challenges. It was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions don't exist outside of the kind of stories that don't have mud on their boots. The Cooper sale challenge took another 4 months, and Carl Cooper got his land back, but the year he'd spent away from it had cost him a herd, and he came back to a place that needed rebuilding. Elsa Pettigrew's youngest got better, slowly, and the medical debt was real, and the restitution money helped but didn't make it simple. Tom Dunnett's relief was genuine and visible, and he still had bad nights sometimes wondering what he'd almost done. And Garrett went to prison, which was justice of a kind, but the particular clerk who had received the Hale payments, a young man who had apparently been told by Garrett that the logging of certain accounts was being handled separately, lost his job too, and he had a family, and Vivian thought about that sometimes without resolution. Things are not tidy. That was the truth of it, the truth underneath the investigation and the newspaper story and the commission findings and all the mechanisms of accountability that had, this time, actually worked. People got hurt in the middle of things that were wrong, and fixing the wrong didn't always fix the hurt, and you carried that. But the land was there, the ranch was there. And on a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost 8 months to the day since Vivian had stepped off a train into a crowd she hadn't expected, Gideon Hale stood in front of the Justice of the Peace in the Blackstone Ridge Courthouse with his hat in his hands and his daughter beside him and his son climbing the furniture in the waiting room under Margaret's increasingly strained supervision, and he married Vivian Mercer properly. Not because it was practical, though it was. Not because it resolved the question of her name, though it did. Because he had asked her to stay, 6 weeks into a 3-week trial, and she had said yes, and staying deserved to be made permanent. It was not a grand ceremony. The Justice of the Peace was elderly and read from a card and mispronounced Vivian's last name, which she did not correct because she was about to change it. Margaret stood in the back in a hat she had clearly purchased for the occasion, which Vivian chose to interpret as the gesture of commitment it was. Cora stood beside her father with the careful composure she brought to everything important, and when the Justice of the Peace said the words that made it official, Vivian saw Cora close her eyes briefly, just for a second, the way people do when they let something they've been holding finally down. Eli, from the furniture, said, "Is it done?" loud enough that the Justice of the Peace lost his place on the card. "Yes," Gideon said. "Good," Eli said, and jumped off the chair. After, on the courthouse steps in the thin spring light, Margaret came to Vivian and stood beside her, and they both looked at the street. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said. The same words Tom Dunnett had used, but with a different texture, something that had been held longer and was heavier to put down. "You were protecting them," Vivian said, "the same way Tom was protecting his family. That's not—" "I was protecting my claim," Margaret said, and said it flatly, without excuse. "I want to be honest about that. I was protecting what I'd built in this family after Eleanor died, because building it was how I survived losing her, and you threatened that." She paused. "I was wrong to take that out on you." Vivian looked at her. At this woman who had grabbed her arm in the street and told her there was nothing for her here, who had left a roast on the kitchen counter, who had gathered 6 families' worth of information in 2 days, who had kept a copy of the evidence document in her jacket. "You pulled those families together," Vivian said. "None of it works without that." "I know," Margaret said. "I'm not fishing for gratitude. I'm just—" She pressed her lips together. "Eleanor would have told me I was being an idiot, sooner than I figured it out myself." "Maybe," Vivian said, "but you figured it out." Margaret looked at her sidelong. It was the closest thing to warmth Vivian had seen in her face that didn't have grief underneath it. "She would have liked you," Margaret said. It was the same thing Gideon had said on the road to Harlan. Vivian thought that if 2 people who had known Eleanor Hale well had arrived at the same conclusion, it was probably worth something. "I would have liked her too," Vivian said. Gideon came out of the courthouse with Eli on his back and Cora beside him, and he stopped on the step and looked at the street. At Blackstone Ridge in the spring, mud on Main Street and the ridge clear against the sky, and the general store, and the livery, and Pell's station, where she'd sat on her trunk in the cold 8 months ago with $43 and a bad knee and no idea what she had walked into. He looked at her. She thought about a girl who had read newspaper advertisements for 8 months and practiced handwriting until she got it right and sent a letter across 3 states because she was 10 years old and frightened and refused to let her family fall apart. A girl who had been carrying too much for too long and had found, in the middle of her desperation, exactly the right person to ask for help. Children do not know they are being brave. That was the thing about it. Cora had not thought of herself as courageous when she sat down at that desk and opened her father's ink and wrote in his hand. She had thought of herself as desperate, as out of options, as someone who had looked at what was happening to her family and had simply refused to accept that nothing could be done. That refusal had started everything. Gideon came down the steps and stood beside her. Eli, from his perch on his father's back, announced that he was hungry. Cora said that was because he'd eaten his breakfast before 6 in the morning and had been awake for 7 hours, and that was a natural consequence. Eli said consequences were for other people. Cora said that was the most Eli thing he had ever said. Gideon said they were going to the hotel for lunch, and everyone needed to stop talking long enough to walk there. And nobody stopped talking long enough to walk there, and they moved down the street together in that particular loud, imperfect way of a family that has found its footing. Margaret fell in beside them, slightly to the outside, which was right for where she was in it. Not outside the circle, not fully inside it either, but there, present, part of the particular irregular shape of the thing they had all built. Vivian walked beside Gideon, and he put his free hand, the one not anchoring Eli, at the small of her back, briefly, for a half a block. And it was such a simple, ordinary gesture that it almost undid her. She had come for a room. Work. Somewhere to be useful. She had gotten something she didn't have a word for when she'd boarded the train in Cincinnati, because she hadn't known to look for it. A place where the people needed her, not because she was performing a function, but because she had shown up and kept showing up and done hard things imperfectly, and told the truth when it was uncomfortable and sat at kitchen tables at 2 in the morning and gone to Harlan with $47 of good evidence and asked Francis Cade to write a story that needed to exist. The ranch was not perfect. It still had the crack under the north roof that Eleanor had been saving to fix, which they would get to this summer. The east fence needed another round of work. Cora still sometimes woke before dawn out of old habit, though she was getting better, and Eli still occasionally ended up in the kitchen at night, though less because he was lost and more because he wanted company. Gideon still worked too hard some days. That was not a thing that would change entirely. It was too deep in him. But he came in for dinner and he laughed sometimes, and he was increasingly fully in his own life instead of waiting at its edges. None of them were what they had been before the losses that had shaped them. You don't get to go back to before. You just go forward into the version of yourself that has absorbed what happened and decided, one morning or one letter or one impossible wagon ride at a time, to keep going anyway. Cora, walking ahead with the precise, purposeful step she always had, turned back briefly to make sure the group was still together and caught Vivian's eye. She didn't smile. She did something better than smiling. She held Vivian's gaze for 1 second with the directness that was her particular way of saying something true without saying it out loud, and then she turned back around and kept walking. Vivian walked through the spring mud of Blackstone Ridge, with her husband's hand at her back and her children's voices ahead, and the ridge above them all, constant and cold and indifferent to human trouble in the way that mountains are, which is actually a comfort when you know how to take it. The morning that had changed everything had been a Tuesday. Mud on Main Street, a crowd that wanted her gone, a girl with a forged letter, and the bravest, most reckless act of love Vivian had ever witnessed. This was also a Tuesday. She thought that was about right. Some doors open because you knocked. Some open because someone on the other side, without knowing who you are or what you need, decided to knock for you. The second kind changes your life in ways the first kind never quite manages, because it comes without the protection of your own expectation. You just walk through it, and then you stay.